and welcome to this talk on stream chemistry. This is the fourth talk in a series in a stream ecology course taught at SMCM during the summer of 2020. This talk is primarily going to focus on nitrogen, phosphorus, and oxygen. And I do want to apologize for people that work on nitrogen and phosphorus in aquatic resources. This is a very short introductory topic on that, and obviously doesn't do that justice in a fair way, but it's still important to at least expose people to and think about. Now, one of the things that I do want students thinking about before we start this is that what we are going to talk about now is a very introductory level to these materials. Whole careers have been made out of studying a small part of some of the cycles within these. As a reminder of what we've covered so far, we discussed quite a bit about discharge and flow so far in this course, and now we're going to spend time talking about nutrients and dissolved oxygen. And nutrients is really a grab bag term. There's a lot of material within that, but for today's purposes, it's going to cover nitrogen and phosphorus. As I generally do before these talks, I provide an outline here about topics which I think are important for you to understand and draw out of this particular lecture. Please come back and check to make sure that you have gotten these points when you're done with the lecture. We really need to make sure that we understand nutrients and oxygen because they have such critical impacts on the way in which organisms within streams exist. In the background is an example of a stream with a slightly different chemistry that's even visible to your eye. Look at that, color is entirely natural. This is the Little Colorado River in Arizona. All right, so let's start with thinking about why things like nutrients are important for organisms. And to do that, we need to back way up and we start to think about organisms not necessarily as we generally do, as this little thing walking around or this plant growing in some location, but as the materials which they're drawing in and then expelling from their bodies. So for instance, plants take in CO2 and H2O, and when they are undergoing photosynthesis, they produce O2 and glucose. And animals take in this glucose or these sugars or these compounds that plants are making, and they use O2 to respire, and they themselves produce CO2 and H2O, and so you get this very simple circular pattern. However, it's not only oxygen and glucose that animals need, and it's not only CO2 and H2O that plants need. And so the additional elements that they are going to need to fuel this cycle are going to be those nutrients that we're going to discuss now. Photosynthesis is very difficult to do. It has appeared very rarely. In fact, the evolution of photosynthesis appears to have occurred just once in the cyanobacteria. And from there, cyanobacteria have been brought into other organisms and modified, but they have never re-evolved the actual photosynthetic pathway de novo, in a sense. So really, it's only been done once in the entire period of the history of life on Earth, which is sort of shocking when we think about it. But part of the reason for that is that it's very, very difficult. It requires a very complex pathway, and it requires a lot of interactions. And some of these steps are not common or easy to do. Things like splitting of water is difficult. Capturing light is actually not too difficult, but capturing light in just the right way to transfer that energy is hard. And then, of course, fixing carbon, which is the process of breaking down CO2, is also very difficult. And the way that plants go about doing this, or one of the ways that I should say that we can start thinking about this, is that plants capture some energy from light inside a very complex structural molecule, and then that energy is transferred to some output. And here on the right, there's chlorophyll A, and it's also showing you what chlorophyll B might look like, two compounds that are used to capture these lights. And you can see it's just that little member off to the edge out there, and believe it or not, that has an important impact on what light is actually captured and how it is moved throughout this molecule. If you think back to that molecule that we just saw on the prior page, I know this is white, just bear with me for a second. Think about all the different elements that you saw in and on that molecule, so those are all going to be important. And if you can, quickly sketch them out and think about what they were. When you're ready, you'll be able to see the actual answers up here. So I would pause the video briefly. A number of important elements were actually present on that chlorophyll, right? So it's not just carbon dioxide and water which make the sugars, but it's a lot of different elements. If you looked at that molecule, you would have seen that there is a lot of nitrogen in there. So plants are very, very dependent on nitrogen compounds. And so nitrogen is going to be very important for plants, and they're going to need a lot of it. In addition to that, if you looked in the center of it, there was a big metal, right? And that was a magnesium ion. So things like magnesium are going to be really important. If you're transferring energy around inside cells, you're going to need a lot of phosphorus because things like ATP, which are energy carriers, are often very dependent on phosphorus. So you're going to need a lot of phosphorus. In addition to that, there's a ton of other things that plants require. And I'm not going to go through each one of these, but I just want you to be aware that the production of sugars from CO2 and H2O, well, we might say, this is very simple. We get some H2O together, we get some CO2 together, and boom, we've got glucose. That's actually a way oversimplified. The actual way of going about doing that is difficult structurally and enzymatically, and so there's a lot of compounds that are needed to actually go about doing it. So plants are going to need potassium, calcium, boron, chlorine, iron, manganese, nickel, copper, zinc, molybdenum. There's all sorts of different elements that they're going to need. And for us, the two that are most commonly dealt with in aquatic systems and the things that are often most limiting for plants will be nitrogen and phosphorus. Okay. Interesting feature about phytoplankton in the marine environment is that it was discovered in the early 1900s that they have a very static relationship between carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus. And that relationship could be described as a ratio of 106 to 16 to 1. This is not a particularly pretty relationship in the sense that it's not like a 2 to 1 or a 3 to 1 relationship, but it turns out that that relationship is very, very static. And the relationship, again, is related between carbon to nitrogen then phosphorus. So you need about 106 carbon atoms to 16 nitrogen atoms to 1 phosphorus atom for marine phytoplankton to go about making their business, which means that if one of those elements, right, is supplied in superabundance and one is limiting, then you will tend to not see the ratio in the organisms change, but their growth will decline remarkably, right, because they won't have it available to them. And marine phytoplankton, you may say to yourself, well, these are not what we deal with. We're not talking about marine phytoplankton. We're talking about stream phytoplankton. Well, those are very, very similar. When you look at stream algae, it turns out they're very close, although we tend to have more carbon and slightly more nitrogen than you would find in a marine phytoplankton. So we tend to have 158 carbon to 18 nitrogen to 1 phosphorus. And another way you might think about this is in streams, we're going to get away with doing slightly more, slightly less phosphorus, but it's going to come at the cost of requiring more nitrogen and more carbon. And this, all of this material, this 106 to 16 to 1, is called the Redfield ratio after the man, Dr. Redfield, who discovered it when he was doing work in ocean voyages around the world. One other term that I've already mentioned and is I should be careful about using it before I actually introduce it in the future is this thing called limiting nutrient. Now, a limiting nutrient can be anything, and what it is the nutrient that is going to limit the production of more of that organism. In many cases, when we think about limiting nutrients, we're going to think about phosphorus. This is just a little peek for what's coming up in the lecture. But I want you to know that you could limit the production of, say, algae with almost anything as long as it's not supplied. So for instance, if you have a chlorophyll molecule and you must have magnesium to make it work, and in the water that you're in there's absolutely no magnesium, then magnesium will be the limiting nutrient. The material cannot be produced until that sufficient quantities of magnesium are supplied. But once magnesium is supplied, then there will be another limiting nutrient. At some point, some other thing will become limiting. And here you can see an example. This is more of an agricultural view of it, and you can see that this is more of a terrestrial view where this particular thing is worried about the production of salts and sulfur and ions that would be in the soil that would be necessary for plants, but it's the same thing. So in water, we might actually have a number of limiting inputs. There's a couple that are very, very common. And there are the three big ones that we're going to cover today. Nitrogen can be a limiting nutrient. Phosphorus can be a limiting nutrient. And one that we're not going to talk about right now, but is also very limiting in streams, is light. Okay, and so light itself can also be a limiting, in a sense, limiting nutrient. I'm putting this in quotes because light is not really a nutrient per se, but it should be reflected in our understanding of production of plants. Now, limiting nutrients come from where? Right? Where are limiting nutrients come from? Now, if you look at this image, right, this is clearly not a stream. This is an enormous lake. This is one of the Great Lakes. This is Lake Erie. The bright green is not a modified color. That is the color of the algae, the phytoplankton that are growing in that river. And what you can see are the big plumes of those phytoplankton as they're getting pushed around the lake. And they're going to respond in a very similar way to water mixing in a bathtub. Right? Certainly, material that is limiting their production must be coming from the land. Because look at how those plumes are tightly coupled with near shoreline effects. Right? We don't see them out in the big central basin areas, but in and around the shorelines where those nutrients are being dumped, then you get huge blooms of algae. If you know anything about that region, you may be able to guess at what's actually going downstream, but you yourself cannot know just by looking at the image what's the limiting nutrient within it. But clearly it has something to do with the application of nutrients from, in our case, agriculture, and also from urbanized areas. All right, so those two will contribute significantly to the availability of nutrients in the system. They are no longer going to be limiting as a nutrient, and phytoplankton in those systems are going to respond. Again, this is a lake system, and I understand that, but the processes are going to be very, very similar in stream systems. One of the things that this much production can cause is what's called a harmful algal bloom, and I know I'm getting a little bit technical and moving away from nutrients, but I want to talk about some of the common issues that are associated with these nutrients because it's so relevant and because this course is cross-listed with environmental studies, and so it's important for you to see how the human elements interact with each other. HABs, which are harmful algal blooms, are common in lakes. They're rarer in streams and rivers, partially because the rivers and streams are moving, so that these HABs get moved along if they're produced, but also partially because they are less commonly occurring in streams and rivers. One thing you may want to answer then is, why is that the case? And what does that suggest about how streams and rivers are going to be different from, say, lakes? Right? So why is it going to be different? Think back to what you've already learned about flow, right? And something that's very, very uniquely different about streams versus lakes. If we think about streams, the unidirectional flow of water is constantly carrying these nutrients away. So even if you elevate them to very, very high levels, you have a hard time maintaining them in place to allow algae to grow. And even if you allow the algae to grow, you have a hard time maintaining it in place to allow it to produce more algae. Compare that, say, to a lake where nutrients arrive and they sit in the water, and they may sit there for a long time, months, days, even, or years in the case of very, very large lakes. And those nutrients will potentially react and form algae, and after those algae grow, they don't go anywhere, and they quite happily grow in the water column. So streams are very, very different from lakes, and as a result, we often think about streams, we study them separately than the way we study lakes, even though they both occur in this very liquid, fluid environment, and they both follow some of the same processes. They are so very different. So that is why we will offer a limnology course this coming spring, hopefully, that will deal with some of the features that we see in standing water, as opposed to these more rapidly moving waters that we're talking about here. All right, so at this point in the lecture, we've talked a little bit about why plants need things other than, say, carbon and water. We've talked a little bit about why those things are critical to the plants themselves beyond just them being necessary. And we've talked a little bit about the effects that can have, right? That we can have these really dramatic effects like harmful algal blooms because we can produce huge quantities of algae, and sometimes those algae can be very dangerous to us. But now what we're going to start with is the phosphorus cycle. And so the phosphorus cycle is the pathway by which phosphorus enters these aquatic systems. And the aquatic system is just one element, right? It's just a conduit of phosphorus through the system. Clearly it comes from somewhere, goes somewhere else, and then gets transferred somewhere else at some point. Phosphorus cycle is a relatively simple cycle, and therefore it's easier to understand. It incidentally is also one of the most important nutrients that is limiting in freshwater systems. So if you are asked what nutrient is limiting in freshwater systems, you should always default to assume it's phosphorus until you have more evidence that it is not. And it is really critical to understand phosphorus limitation in view of things like harmful algal blooms, which are becoming major problems in and around the world. So phosphorus is really important for animals. It's also really important for plants. One of the reasons it's really important, we think it's really important for animals, I should say, is because we think of things like bones. And calcium phosphate, which is what bones are made out of, is really heavily invested in phosphorus, right? So there's a lot of phosphorus that makes up your bones. All right, so bones are not in plants, so why are you bringing this up? Well, the fact that calcium phosphate is used in bones is related to the fact that phosphorus is a common molecule found in organisms, right? And calcium phosphate was a useful compound to produce this structurally rigid thing that you could stretch and pull muscles across. But the fact is that phosphorus is common in a lot of different things. For instance, right, ATP, which I've already mentioned in this lecture, is an energy carrying molecule and it carries 3 phosphorus ions in it. Every single phospholipid, the very name phospho, right, includes phosphorus in the name, right? Every single one of those lipid molecules has a phosphate portion. That means that of all the many millions and millions and billions and trillions of little lipid atoms floating around, not lipid atoms, lipid molecules floating around in your body, many of them are also bound to this phosphorus molecule. So phosphorus is very common. And those two things alone are found in both plants and animals. In addition to that, phosphorus will be found in bones in some animals. So plants, just as much as us, need lots of phosphorus. They can't get away from it. Even when we think of, oh, lipids, you know, that's carbon and hydrogen. Well, it's mostly carbon and hydrogen, but there's a lot of other stuff too. So things like phosphorus are going to be really important for plants for transfer of energy, for building of things like their cellular membrane, and so their regular day-to-day living. Phosphorus is a fairly straightforward thing to understand. Phosphorus comes from rocks that have been deposited in the bottoms of oceans. Okay, so there can be rocks with lots of phosphorus in it. It erodes from that rock via water and therefore enters into aquatic systems through streams and rain, and then it moves into larger bodies of water where it either gets used as for algae or it gets taken up by plants. Those plants eventually die, they sediment to the bottom of that system, and they get buried away and become, at some point, those rocks again. In addition to that, there is a lot of animal life on the surface of the earth, which is also constantly contributing phosphorus. So if you have, let's say, a fish die, a big fish, let's say, die in a small aquarium, and then you don't realize it and you come back and the aquarium is filled with really gross algae, that's because that fish is contributing a significant amount of phosphorus to the water suddenly, and that algae is able to grow very rapidly. So animals can also be serious contributors to phosphorus cycles when there are a lot of them. But in general, we think about this as rocks and plants. This is a relatively straightforward material. It never enters the air. There is no phosphorus compound that's associated with an aerial form. It is easily dissolved in water, so it moves and follows water just the same way that you've looked at streams moving around. And when it gets incorporated into animals or plants, it often stays there for long periods of time. So phosphorus, as it enters streams, is going to always be moving down and away from the source. And that is because it is a very hydrophilic molecule, right? Phosphorus very easily picks up things like oxygens. Oxygens often have a strong negative charge associated with them, and therefore they will dissolve easily in water. Hence the reason that phosphorus used to be added to soaps, because it helped things dissolve in it, and it itself would dissolve very easily when wetted. So you could produce lots of very high quality soaps. However, that produced huge amounts of phosphorus runoff into lakes and rivers, and that ultimately caused issues. Phosphorus, just as in anywhere else in streams, can accumulate in sediments through the process of adsorption or absorption, Okay, I know that they sound very similar. It's just a switch between a D or a B. The molecules themselves can therefore remain in the system for some period of time. The turnover rate, which is related to the storage volume and the annual outflow from the system, is a measure of how long it would basically take to replace the material within the system. And in streams, we often think of phosphorus on the order of seconds to years, probably somewhere closer to weeks is a more average amount. What that means is that phosphorus that enters streams is either rapidly incorporated into organisms or it's moved away very, very rapidly. So it goes downstream to lakes. The streams are always going to be in need of phosphorus because that phosphorus is always leaving. Now this is a good example of how we know that phosphorus is in fact a limiting nutrient. So these are waters that are taken from, in this case, a pond. The one on the far left, let me get my marker out. The one on the far left is a control one. That is just pond water. You can see there's a slight green tinge to it, which means there is some phytoplankton in it. And your eye is actually very good at detecting color changes, which is why we don't need any specialized equipment to do this. If you go ahead and use bleach, not necessarily to kill viruses, but to kill phytoplankton, you can do that very well. And you can see that that bottle clears right up. You get a nice clear bottle. You've killed everything in it. If you add a whole bunch of stuff, right? If you add every possible thing you could imagine, you get lots and lots and lots of algae growth. So there's all sorts of material being added to this bottle. Probably what's becoming limiting at that point is in fact light. There's so much algae that it's blocking other algae from getting light. If on the other hand you just add phosphorus, right, you get almost the same effect. And this is a great example of how potent phosphorus is in aquatic system. Excuse me. If you added nitrogen to that system, right, what you'll see is basically no effect. This bottle here is not substantially different in color from this bottle, which suggests that nitrogen has no impact. And we haven't talked about nitrogen yet, but I want to convince you that aquatic systems really want this stuff. The good stuff is phosphorus. Now, as you get into more sophisticated understandings about the system you may be studying, you may find that this general rule is not the case. The phosphorus may not be limiting in your system, or that it may change through time. So phosphorus may be limiting at one part of the year, and then nitrogen and maybe another, and maybe nitrogen and phosphorus become limiting at some point, or that there may be some other thing that's limiting. But as a general rule, we can start by assuming that phosphorus is limited, and then try to work back from there. And that's in a little bottle. That's really, really cool, right? But you can do this at a much larger level, right? So you can start to do this in very, very large aquatic systems. Here is a lake that's been divided to convince you that there is limitation in these systems. And it's divided by having a tarp run down. So they actually put a tarp right down here. That's what I'm trying to highlight in red. I'm sorry that the cursor jumps up and down. It's a Microsoft issue. And on this side over here, there is in fact nothing added to that lake water, and it remains relatively dark and clear. In fact, you can see some of the rocks through the water. And on this side, they added a bunch of phosphorus, and lo and behold, even at the lake level, right, you get enormous responses to that. Okay, so it's not just about showing that it works in a little tiny water bottle, although it does. You can actually scale it up to lake-wide effect and see that kind of thing. And you might be able to do the same things with streams or rivers. You just have to work really hard because remember that phosphorus is constantly fleeing the scene, so to speak. It's constantly being washed out of those systems. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit now about nitrogen. The phosphorus cycle, as we just went through, is relatively simple. There's a rock that erodes, that phosphorus enters a system, it leaves the system, it gets deposited as a rock, and then we go back and around and around and around again. Nitrogen, of course, is critical for everything. Everybody that's alive has nitrogen, and there is nitrogen all over the place in your body. Everything you can think of probably has some nitrogen associated with it. Of course, it's really, really critical in proteins for a variety of reasons, but it's a very common molecule in proteins. And it's also one of the most common elements in our atmosphere, and yet it's really hard to actually use it, right? It's going to enter and exit primarily through fixation from bacteria, right? Bacteria are going to do a lot of the hard work here. One thing I do want to alert you to before I show you this, why this slide is really boring and I'm not going to show you much at first, is this is too complex for us to spend a lot of time on, and hence the reason I had the caveat at the beginning of this lecture. The nitrogen cycle is a complex cycle, and we could probably spend a whole week just talking about the nitrogen cycle if I wanted you to understand it at some simple level. What I do want you to understand is a very, very simplified version of it, and just appreciate how nitrogen compounds change in the aquatic system and how nitrogen moves in and out of what we call organic forms. We're going to follow that sort of dumbed down version so that we can understand the nitrogen cycle to some degree. But I want you to appreciate as well that the complexity here, if you're interested in this, and I find things like this very interesting, so don't be afraid if you also find it interesting, deserves more time. But we can't give it to it in this particular course. All right, so there is a lot of stuff going on here. And what I don't want you to really focus in on this stuff yet. What I want you to understand first is nitrogen compounds have a gaseous phase. Multiple types of gases can have nitrogen in them. There's a lot of nitrogen floating around in a gas form all the time. They are impacted by the availability of oxygen. Okay, so that's going to have huge impacts on how this cycle functions, because things that happen very close to the surface of, say, sediments and soils are going to be very, very different than things that happen really deep and far away. And they are really complex. There are lots of different molecules that nitrogen can be. If you look down here at the bottom, you can see just a couple. There's ammonium, they've listed, nitrate, nitrite, nitrate. There's things like this where it's a whole bunch of different compounds, but they've given up and they've just called it some generalized term. Here's SON, which is soluble organic nitrogen. There's a whole bunch of stuff that suggests also that there's an insoluble organic nitrogen. So there's a whole bunch of different ones. I'm not going to get too involved in that. This, I just want you to appreciate the complexity that this cycle has. This is a simplified version of it, and we're going to go even more simplified, but I want you to understand that one of the reasons that this is occurring is because of how many forms nitrogen can take on. All right, so let's bring it down to even more simplified and generalized form so that we can understand it. Nitrogen comes in what we think of as two flavors, organic and inorganic. All the things on the right here that are not labeled inorganic are in fact inorganic. Okay, this is a generalized term. Organic molecules are relatively complex. They have to be more complex than ammonia or ammonium, which are very closely related in molecules. If they're not more complex than ammonium or ammonia, then they are considered inorganic. If they are more complex, then they will be considered organic. So for instance, amino acids would be considered organic. If you look at N2 in the atmosphere, that would be considered inorganic in a sense, all right? One of the things that, of course, is very, very common in and around us all the time is that we have N2 in the atmosphere. So N2 is everywhere. It's in your streams, but it's also in the air around you. It penetrates every surface that air would penetrate, right? And it's very, very common as a result of that. In spite of that, N2 is incredibly difficult to deal with if you want to use it to make organic molecules, because nitrogen forms a triple bond with itself, and it's very, very stable. It's very, very hard to split nitrogen. And to split nitrogen apart from other nitrogen atoms takes a lot of energy, and it has evolved, as far as I know, only once. There are plants that co-opt bacteria which do it, but it is very, very difficult to do. Nitrogen, when it is split, will often be split and produce nitrates and nitrites, which are basically nitrogens that are attached with a bunch of oxygen. And if you split the oxygens off, so if you slice the oxygens away, you can attach hydrogen to it. That can make ammonia. Ammonia is a potent compound. You can smell it. It's a great cleaner, right? It's very reactive. And as a result of that, because it's very reactive, it doesn't hang around for a long period of time, and it decays very easily into other compounds. So organisms that go about making these are going to go about making them and have to use them quickly or lose them. Okay, and then anytime that we have a process that makes nitrogen into something else, we'll have a process that reverses it the other direction. All right, so in general, this is how we might think about how nitrogen is actually brought into aquatic organisms. There's a bunch of nitrogen floating around in the air, and there are specialized bacteria which can produce anoxic regions within their colonies. And in those anoxic regions, they're able to convert that nitrogen in the air into compounds that they can start to synthesize synthesize inorganic nitrogen into organic nitrogen. If you look at this diagram here and you zoom in with your eyes, you'll see that this arrow from N2 to NO3 actually has the word lightning next to it, right? And that's a natural process which converts N2 into NO3. So when lightning strikes, it actually converts some of the nitrogen in the atmosphere into NO3. Really HNO3 is what it would be produced into. But bacteria actually do this differently. They convert the N2 into ammonia, okay? And that ammonia can easily be moved into different types of things. It can be converted into organic materials, or it can be converted into NO2 or NO3. But this process is called fixation, nitrogen fixation. So bacteria can fix nitrogen. It's critical that it occur without oxygen, because if it does occur with oxygen, you'll tend to produce these nitrogen oxide compounds as opposed to ammonia, which you want. Ammonia can be converted into organic molecules, or it can be moved and mobilized in other directions. All right. If you have ammonia in the water column, bacteria will rapidly convert that to NO2 negative, and that will be converted to NO3 negative, assuming oxygen is present, because oxygen is necessary, right, to be added to that. If you have ever kept fish, you'll know that what you're trying to do is get ammonia, which the fish are excreting, to nitrate to nitrate as quickly as possible. Ammonia is very dangerous, even in very low concentrations. Nitrite is dangerous, but the concentrations can be much higher. And nitrate is relatively unimportant for a fish. They can get ridiculously high concentrations. It doesn't seem to bother them. It's not nearly as reactive. This can all happen in the water column, right? But one of the cool things about streams is that there's more than just the water. As you enter the sediment, so as this material rains out onto the sediment, it can enter areas that really have no oxygen or have very low amounts of oxygen. And this process called denitrification can happen. And denitrification is this arrow down here. And what actually happens in that case is that instead of nitrogen being bound to lots and lots of oxygen now, nitrogen actually starts to return to being bound just to nitrogen. Okay, so oxygens are stripped off, right? 2 oxygen are stripped out, and you get N2O, nitrous oxide. All right, nitrous oxide is a common molecule. It's fairly simple, and you would probably know it as laughing gas. Okay, there's not that much. It's not. I'm not recommending you go bury your head in stream sediments to see if you can get that laughing gas like feeling, but there is a small amount of nitrous oxide that is actually available in stream sediments. Nitrous oxide can be converted to full-on nitrogen gas by liberating more oxygen, and if that nitrogen gas can escape, then it will re-enter the atmosphere. Sometimes it can be trapped in sediment. So part of what you're liberating when you're walking around in, say, a really muddy area of a stream is nitrogen gas. It's not all that clearly. Nitrogen gas has no scent, so when you're walking around those sediments and you get really strong smells, that's not the nitrogen gas you're smelling. But in addition to some of the other gases you're releasing, you are in fact releasing nitrogen gas. You can also, that nitrogen gas, if it's trapped in the sediment, can be converted directly into organic nitrogen again. All right, so there's a couple of compounds here that I want you to be aware of. Nitrogen gas, I want you to understand ammonia, and ammonia converts to ammonium in water very easily, which is that it adds just a hydrogen atom and gets charged. Nitrite and nitrate, nitrous oxide, nitrogen gas reappears again, and then this catch-all term, which is organic nitrogen. And organic nitrogen can be used for a long time as an organic nitrogen, although it can be broken down and converted back to other things through a process called mineralization and then liberated again into the atmosphere. This is a zoomed in version of it. I'm going to leave this as an available slide so that students that are trying to study this have a chance to see it. The other thing I want to point out is that O2 is really important in this process, so we're going to talk about O2 a bit in this lecture. Now, nitrogen fixation is very difficult because of this triple bond, right? You can see down here my beautifully sketched out triple bond, which is exactly what it looks like if you zoom in on these molecules. It's actually two ends floating around and a bunch of little straight lines that connect them. Those triple bonds can be broken inside of these things called heterocysts in bacteria. It's very difficult to do in an oxygen environment, so these heterocysts, which are actually modified cells, are actually exclude oxygen. So they have a very thickened cell wall that prevents access from oxygen. And as a result, they can be in an oxic environment, even though inside of them is anoxic. And inside of that, those heterocysts are able to go about breaking down nitrogen from an inorganic into organic materials, right? And this is bacteria. In addition to that, what you can see is that these are green bacteria, which means they're cyanobacteria, which means that they're photosynthesizers. So some of those harmful algal blooms actually have the ability to generate their own nitrogen, which is one of the reasons that phosphorus is very limiting in aquatic systems and nitrogen is usually not. Because phytoplankton, some phytoplankton I should say, are actually able to go about making their own nitrogen. So it doesn't really matter in one sense if nitrogen is available or not to them. They can survive with or without it. They can literally pull down the almost unlimited amounts of nitrogen which are all around them all the time that other organisms can't use. But phosphorus they can't make. They can't make a phosphorus atom. They're always stuck waiting for it. All right, and now we start to talk about oxygen. And as I've already alluded to in the nitrogen cycle, there's a lot of these features which are related to oxygen availability. And so if we're going to understand anything about nitrogen, we should also be thoughtful about how oxygen interacts with it. In addition to that, oxygen is really critical for animals at all levels, right? Fish, bugs, all the cool stuff that we see in streams is really dependent on oxygen. Oxygen cycle is apparently very simple on the outside, but it has enormous layers of complexity because of the way it interacts with other cycles. But it's still really critical that we tackle, and we are going to have to spend some time thinking about it. And we're going to hit it at multiple angles. Oxygen is very, very, very common in the Earth's crust, and now very, very common in its atmosphere. Okay. One of the reasons that I have to say "and now" is because oxygen has not always been common in the Earth's atmosphere. In fact, oxygen initially was very uncommon in the Earth's atmosphere. And many organisms that are alive today are very sensitive to oxygen levels, not least of which yourself. Your own cells, although you think of yourself as an oxygen-breathing machine, are very sensitive to high oxygen levels. And so your body maintains very low oxygen levels, but provides some oxygen to allow cells to go about doing their really active material. But in general, keeps the oxygen values fairly low. When you compare that to, say, early Earth, that makes sense. Most of the eukaryotic systems that evolved in a world with very low oxygen, and then had to be modified to live in a world where there was lots of oxygen around. And oxygen, therefore, has to have come from somewhere. And it turns out it's life itself that makes oxygen. Going back again to the cyanobacteria, not only did they come up with photosynthesis, but therefore they made oxygen, right? So they produced this waste product, O2, which they didn't want, and ultimately filled up the atmosphere with oxygen. In addition to that, they went about finding out how to break down and fix nitrogen, right? These are really fabulously cool organisms. They've done all sorts of neat stuff that have modified the system for every other organism that have come after them. Now, one of the things that they've been important with doing is that they've made oxygen very common in surface rock. What do I mean by that? Well, it turns out if you release a bunch of oxygen in the atmosphere and it reacts with things and those things sediment and they get mineralized, which looks a lot like the phosphorus cycle, then suddenly you have a lot of rocks with oxygen in it. So things like cyanobacteria have been really important for making rocks that contain lots of oxygen. What is it that makes oxygen common in our world, though? So why is oxygen very common? How do we go about getting it? Well, oxygen, of course, is created in stars, And if you know anything about the sun, you'll know that it's mostly hydrogen and helium. But when that helium starts to collide together, it actually will make other atoms. And one of the common things in our universe, things like carbon and oxygen and nitrogen, are all very light things because that's what's very easy to make in stars. Some of the things that are very, very hard to make are much heavier than that. It turns out the sun, without going into, say, a nova or a supernova, is really only going to be able to make atoms up to about the size of iron. Okay, oxygen tends to be a much lighter atom than iron, and so it can make the suns will make lots and lots of oxygen. I know this seems a little bit distant from stream ecology, but I want you to appreciate why oxygen is so common in these environments. And it's a very simple process, right? Two hydrogen ions hit each other, they make some more hydrogen, then those hit each other, make some heliums run into each other. It makes some helium and it makes some more hydrogen. And if a bunch of heliums start to run into each other, then you start to get into all sorts of cool things like carbon and nitrogen and oxygen. And helium here at the bottom, you can see helium-4. It turns out that the most common isotope of oxygen has an atomic weight of 16, which means it's 4 heliums smashed together, right? And you can do this, right? This is what it looks like if you actually see it. So here's 2 heliums running into each other. They make beryllium. A beryllium and another helium will make your carbon. And if you add another helium, then you'll get your oxygen. If we look at what makes up the Earth's crust by weight, we'll find that it's mostly oxygen and then silicon, which makes sense because that's sand, silicon dioxide. So oxygen is very, very common, but it has not always been so in our atmosphere. And the fact that it is now common in our atmosphere means that it has interesting dynamics on streams and waters as well. So one other thing that's important to understand is that oxygen is not equally distributed between, say, atmosphere and water. It has a hard time getting into water, and even when it does, not very much of it is actually present within water. If you take a glass of water and you were to look into it and you were able to see oxygen, you would see it makes up a very minor fraction of that total volume that is taken up. Most of that is, as you would expect, water. Another small fraction would be things like salts. So access of oxygen for organisms is going to be really hard at times in places like streams. One of the things that's going to consume oxygen are the animals and actually the plants, remember, because plants have to have a metabolism to live. But they will produce oxygen during the day. So during the day, plants are producing oxygen and that is being released into the water. And the way that oxygen is getting down, let's say, to the very bottom of the water is by things like wind, and in the case of streams, the physical movement of water. So when you go out to a stream, the water actually physically moving around is exposing lots of surface area, and it's bringing lots of water from all over the place and mixing it together and maintaining relatively high levels of oxygen in the water. And that is true in small, shallow streams in general. But there are times where oxygen's diffusion rate is very, very low, and it's not sufficient to meet the demands of the system. One of the other things that ties oxygen to something we brought up earlier, harmful algal blooms, is that harmful algal blooms, even though they're photosynthetic, often result in low oxygen scenarios or locations. But I just went through and told you that plants produce oxygen, right? Obviously, you know that's a byproduct of photosynthesis. So what is actually going on here? Well, in the case of HABs, algae are actually producing oxygen. Again, that's true during the day, although they're consuming it at night. But the more important element is as they die, they start to sink and they fill up regions and they begin to decompose. And this decomposition, which is aided by bacteria and fungi, right, that actually the process of breaking all that down, creates areas of very low oxygen because the bacteria and fungi become so numerous that they consume all of the oxygen, and often they're in deeper waters. Now, this is a phenomenon most often seen in lakes. However, and I want to stress this, it can occur in very large rivers. So we can see harmful algal blooms or in locations where the large water bodies act like rivers and water flow is low and it takes a long time to move around, then you can get these large algal blooms. So in stagnant rivers in and around cities, right, urbanized rivers, you may also see things like harmful algal blooms appearing. So this is a common phenomena and a problem for water bodies around the world now. The other thing to keep in mind about dissolved oxygen is it's strongly related to the temperature of the water. So water has oxygen in it, not a ton, but there is some. But the dissolved oxygen decreases as temperature rises. So results in the fact that animals, as temperature increases, need more oxygen, but oxygen capacity that the water can actually hold goes way down. So that means animals are going to be in very stressed situations as water temperatures rise. And when waters get up to, say, 30 centigrade, you really start to run into oxygen stress for a lot of different organisms, regardless of whether there is lots of oxygen diffusing into the water or not. And that temperature, right, 30 centigrade, is not that warm, right? That's warm, certainly, but humans would be quite comfortable operating in a temperature of 30 degrees. So when we think about streams and organisms, think about also the temperature. Organisms in cooler streams will have much less oxygen stress. Organisms in hotter streams will have much more oxygen stress. And those temperatures are going to change over the course of seasons, and they may change between locations in a stream. Areas that are sheltered in a stream may be cooler, whereas areas more exposed to sunlight may be hotter. We're not going to talk about this here, but saline waters also contain less oxygen, but I'm not terribly worried about you understanding that because it's relatively unimportant. There are very few saline streams that we need to deal with. The other thing to keep in mind is that DO capacity goes down with increasing altitude. There is less pressure at higher altitudes because the molecules are further apart, and because they're further apart, they're pushing less strongly on the waters. And so as you move up into mountains, it will actually be harder to maintain oxygen levels in water because it will naturally diffuse. It won't, I should say, it will not diffuse in very quickly, and the amount will saturate faster. And so streams that are hot and high in elevation will be very stressful environments. And you may say, well, that's not very likely. High elevations will often be mountains, so they'll tend to have strong gradients, and so they'll flow faster, and they'll tend to be colder environments. That is maybe true for many cases, but if you think of something like a plateau, then you could end up in a situation that during, say, a summer months where there's a lot of incident light, that the temperature and the would get quite high in those, and therefore the oxygen capacity of those streams would decline quite considerably. All right, so organisms also have to deal with this based on an altitudinal change. There's good general rules of thumbs when we think about this. Anoxic water is water that has no oxygen in it. So that would be 0 milligrams per liter, which is the conventional way we show oxygen. As a rule, nothing of a multicellular animal life can live in those waters. That's not entirely the case, but it is a general rule. You'll find almost nothing there. In hypoxic waters, waters with very little oxygen, so think of that as maybe I've seen people categorize that as high as 4 milligrams per liter, but generally 2 milligrams per liter is pretty low. You're moving away from things like fish, and that's often what people are concerned about. Hypoxic waters have very little oxygen, but you can still have metazoans, animal life there. Frequently, if you're in hypoxic waters, the only thing you'll see are worms, and they'll usually be smaller worms. If you look at this chart on the right, you'll get an idea about some of the organisms that are in and around us and the kind of oxygen tolerances they have. You can see that large predatory active animals probably need on the order of 5 to 6 milligrams per liter, but other things can tolerate much lower levels. Toleration or minimum requirements may not be sufficient to allow the organisms to go about their natural behavior, though. So the change in oxygen is going to have really important effects. It may be possible, for instance, for prey fish to hide in areas where oxygen levels are much lower and predators cannot chase them, but they themselves may have a very hard time finding food, so they may need to leave those refuges. At other times, maybe oxygen levels will decline as parts of a stream get cut off from other parts of the stream, and oxygen levels decline because the little pool that's now formed, it gets very hot and it has very little entrance of water, or maybe groundwater, which tends to be very oxygen deplete, starts to penetrate and add to that pool, and that can also cause issues. All right, so these are just general rules of thumb, but I do want you to understand the difference between hypoxic and anoxic. And again, here's just some more examples. This is more stream focused, But you can see that when we're down in these 1 to 4 milligrams per liter, we're pretty low. Certainly by the time we get down into zeros, most of what you're going to find there is bacteria. But there are a variety of species which have evolved to take advantage of these low oxygen zones. And some of them live in Maryland. One of them that does not naturally live in Maryland, although there's probably thousands of, or maybe even hundreds of thousands of these in Maryland at any one time, are betta fish. Bettas actually have a lung-like organ in their head. It's called a labyrinth organ. It's a convoluted region in and around the gill area where they actually suck oxygen in. And that actually causes an issue in that beta gills have to be smaller to provide room for this labyrinth organ. And as a result of that, bettas can drown. They need to regularly breathe at the surface. They cannot supply enough oxygen to their bodies just with their gills. It does, however, give bettas a huge advantage in that when they are in really stagnant water bodies where oxygen is low, then they can access the surface water and they will not die. Even as surface waters get close to zero, it's relatively unimportant for them. They can keep breathing at the surface, and so oxygen in the water is no limitation. This animal, this picture here of this betta, is not natural betta. Obviously, this is a farmed fish that is produced for these colors and traits. Wild bettas do not have fins like this, but they do have very attractive colors, although not quite like these ones. Bettas belong to a larger group of fish that breathe at the surface, and numerous groups of fish have evolved the ability to breathe at surfaces, so that should give you some indication that stream oxygen content is highly variable in many different places. Here's an example of that labyrinth organ. You can see it's tucked up here behind the eye, and it actually crowds out room in the gills. In our own Maryland, naturally, we have this group called the mud minnows. The mud minnows are, maybe as you would expect, often found in muddy regions, which tend to be low in oxygen. You will find them in streams very easily. Mud minnows are very happy to breathe at the surface of the water, and they can survive extremely low oxygen content. Here's an example of that. I like this. I found this online. Someone was discussing where they actually went and collected mud minnows. But my favorite part about this is this portion here in bold that I'll read. Repeatedly dredging up several cups of sludge, running to the pond to rinse as much mud as possible, which resulted each time in one or more quite fat and healthy looking eastern mud minnows. This amazed me, seeing as the water was actually hot to the touch and barely water at all. And this is really impressive for a variety of reasons, but it goes to show how these adaptations allow these organisms to live in waters that effectively have not sufficient oxygen to allow animal life to live. They're not dependent on the oxygen in the water, they're dependent on oxygen in the air. So this is impressive. But if this person had, say, had poured oil onto the surface of the water and come back, the mud minnows would actually have died because they wouldn't have been able to breathe at the surface. I'm not recommending this, but if you do have something like mosquitoes forming in waters in and around your house and you don't want to get rid of the waters, go ahead and buy some cheap canola oil and pour it on the water. It will seal that area and the mosquitoes will die too. They're also adapted to breathing atmospheric air. And here's a good example of fish that are demonstrating how they might survive in a low oxygen environment in a stream. And a lot of organisms actually do this. They move very close to the surface of the water. And that makes a lot of sense. The surface of the water is close to this large reservoir of oxygen, which is the air, and oxygen will diffuse first to the surface of the water and then diffuse into the water body itself from there. So the surface will tend to have the highest concentrations of water. In addition to that, if you can keep your gills wet and you can suck in sort of air and water and pull that over the gill, you'll actually still manage to extract oxygen from that. So these types of organisms will often suck in mouthfuls of sort of watery air, or they themselves also have what are effectively lungs that they can suck air into and extract oxygen that way. So if you go to an area with very low dissolved oxygen, you will frequently find fish crowding at the surface. Now this makes them extraordinarily vulnerable to bird predators, but it does allow them to survive day to day when oxygen levels vary. And this is, again, an important consideration when you look at streams. We are often thinking of streams as, oh, these are these static, unchanging things. But streams, if any ecosystem, are extremely dynamic. They change moment to moment, day to day. Even at a single point, you really have to tell me where you are, right? Even if I say, you went to this stream, yes. Were you in a pool? Were you in a riffle? Were you at the surface? Were you at the sediment? Were you out in the middle of the day? Were you in the evening? Did you go at night, right? So there's huge amounts of variation in these ecosystems through even short periods of time and location. And that brings me to seasonal changes, right? So dissolved oxygen has enormous changes across seasons, right? So if we think about it, think about how dissolved oxygen levels would change across the season of a temperate stream. I would sketch that. Think about that. So do it for, let's say, a 12-month period and draw the concentration of dissolved oxygen on one axis and the month on the x-axis. And if you do that, you'll get something like this. Now, this is measured, right? And so what you can see is that the black line is the temperature, and the blue line is the dissolved oxygen. And just as you would expect, oh, I'm sorry, I apologize, it's inverted to that. The blue line is the temperature, the black line is dissolved oxygen. So just as you would expect, in the winter when temperatures are cool, dissolved oxygen is high. In the spring, that declines, so there is a continuous decline through the spring. And then in the summer, it's fairly erratic, right? It goes from fairly low concentrations, approaching some of those numbers that you saw before. This is down to maybe about 6 milligrams per liter. You're starting to put some stress on a variety of different fish, all the way up to 10 or 11, which is almost a stressless environment, even for things like trout, are very able to survive at those levels. In the fall, it becomes less erratic, although it still bounces around quite a bit. And then as soon as you enter those very cold months, you can see there's a rapid shift, these very high concentrations of water, and stream temperature remains cold at that point. One thing that's really important is that in streams, riffles and waterfalls are important introducers of oxygen. They enormously increase the surface area of water in contact with the atmosphere, and they are, in a sense, percolating that water through the air and allowing a lot of oxygen to enter, and also allowing things like CO2 to diffuse. So you can actually, at places like riffles and waterfalls, oversaturate. You can get so much oxygen in there that oxygen actually diffuses back out of the water further downstream. So if you take a dissolved oxygen meter and you put it in a riffle, don't be surprised if it reads 110 or 120%. Be surprised if it reads 120%, you're in a hot, stagnant pool. That would be surprising. But don't be surprised if you see saturation higher than 100%. That can happen. It takes time for oxygen to go out, and it takes time for it to go in. And so in places where you can saturate a lot of oxygen or oversaturate oxygen, it will take some time downstream before it truly comes out. Right. And so organisms that live in riffles or live in very high velocity environments will be very prone to oxygen stress because they tend to live in environments with very, very, very high oxygen concentrations. One thing I haven't mentioned so far is oxygen is stressful for organisms to live in high concentrations of because it is difficult to deal with. It is a very reactive molecule. It does enormous amounts of damage, and it's very hard to keep out of systems. It penetrates through cell membranes very easily. And so while you may be able to get lots of oxygen easily, that comes at the cost that the oxygen is doing a lot of damage to systems, and it will require a lot of upkeep to maintain those systems as the damage occurs in them. Lastly, and I already mentioned this, depth has a huge role on oxygen. Okay, and this is also related to those HABs, right? So if HABs were only produced in very, very shallow areas, we probably really couldn't deplete the oxygen. It'd be really hard to do. But in many cases, oxygen declines very considerably with depth because it's really diffusing in just at the top, and then it's being used up as you move down. And it will be used up by organisms and plants, again, remember, during the day, and it will reach something called an oxygen minimum zone, right, in very deep waters. I'm not terribly concerned that we go into a bunch of this. This is more of a lake-wide system, and I'd deal with that if we got into limnology proper. But I want you to know that that rapid decline in oxygen is called a pycnocline because it's a rapid chemical shift. It often occurs very, very fast. If to test your own understanding, I would ask you this question: why does oxygen go back up as you increase to greater and greater depths? And don't be afraid to look this stuff up. This is a very common phenomena in lakes and oceans and estuaries. We don't see it nearly so much in streams or rivers, mostly because they're just not deep enough to get these huge changes. But it does occur when you get into very, very deep areas. All right, so we have now gone through a couple bits of chemistry, nitrogen, phosphorus, and oxygen. Next up, we'll deal with carbon chemistry, and I promise that that lecture will be a little bit shorter.